the team here at Dundee Shirt for giving us the space, the Arts Council, Kerry County Council, Kerry Arts, Forest na Gaeilge, Ali na Gaeilge, RTE, and of course our associate sponsor Dingle Distillery, who've been so helpful and supportive to us. So without further ado, Mr. Declan O'Rourke. I'm give you a little bit of intro on Declan, although I know everybody here knows him. But you know, one of Ireland's most loved singer-songwriters, and I think you've been around longer than I'd care to mention. I remember seeing you playing 20 years ago, I'd say, at this stage, upstairs in a pub on Camden Street in Dublin or somewhere. But this is a career pivot, as they say, and a very welcome one. The book has only been out a short while, but it's already going so well. Declan's debut album in 2004 entered the charts at number 5, and he's beaten that already with his debut novel, which has entered the bestseller list at number 4. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
We're excited to see what this week's announcement on the charts bring after a very successful week. You've been
Me too.
Yeah, it's a great achievement for your first book, and I think having been reading it, I have to say it's such an impressive first book for anyone. And I was just joking with Declan here. He really was like, "Go big or go home." It's quite an achievement here, and for anyone who hasn't yet had a chance to read it, the Pawnbroker's reward is meticulously researched. It is a book set in Macroom during the famine, and it has so many facets in it. It has personal family life, it has political, it has social, it has so much research, but also so much heart in it as well, with the human side of the story. So it's a really impressive debut for anyone, and for someone who's only starting his career writing, and hopefully it's a very long and enduring career writing. It's a fabulous read. So I'd highly encourage everyone to pick up a copy after. But I hope Declan is going to give us a little flavour of it. And I'd love you to start with a little reading, because the opening of the book is so evocative that I think it will bring you straight into it. So I'd love you to start with the first opening, if you would.
Absolutely. Thank you, Deanna. I was happy to let you keep talking there. You were
We'll have more flattery later.
raising the bar. Thank you. Okay, the first chapter is called Every Sinew. A wheeze was followed by a gasping suck for air. With legs trembling, he felt himself lurch forward and stumble. Recovering, gasping again in pitch-black emptiness, an arm reached out, blind, grabbing at the air, but found nothing. Every sinew and every fibre of his body burned from the ground up. Each step was now a gargantuan effort. The cold and damp air of the night, blowing infrequently, was the only balm to the fire in his skin. Exhausted, his mind teetering on the edge of consciousness, heart bursting under the strain, each part of him had pushed the limits of endurance and might give way at any moment. A raging fever was consuming him. The choked pulse throbbed in his ears, the wheezing of his lungs, his tongue panting like a spent horse, the intermittent coughs and groans from within. Blood and vomit stained the taste of his cut mouth. One at a time, the effort to lift each foot up and over the grass tussocks, the strain of his eyes to perceive the ground in absolute darkness, an overwhelming urge to lie down. His body begged for rest, but he could sense the hill. It was just before him somewhere. He tried to focus on that, not the pain. But how? To climb it seemed impossible. If he stopped now, he would never get there. Oblivious as a fallen roof leaning on him to the unbearable burden, a dead weight pressed into his back. Somewhere in the depths of a dream, a voice chanted, "Guran Nagapal, Dira Lee," the mirthful laughter of a little girl. "Sheila!" he called out. Page 1.
So I think what struck me so strongly when you start reading the book is it brings you right into what people are experiencing at that time. And even though when we're in school in Ireland growing up, even if you're not good at history, I don't think there's a person that doesn't know the dates of the famine. And I actually had to go back and look at the back of the book and kind of double check it. It is 1846, because what really struck me with the book was how I was kind of doing the maths in my head going, that's like my grandmother's grandmother was alive in this time, and you've made it so real to me. And it's so shocking when you read about their lives that they were living. And this is all based on real people who existed, which I think we'll discuss in a little bit in a moment, that, you know, the rate of change in our country has been exponential since the famine, socially, economically, all of that. And it's like getting into a time machine and going right back there. And it is truly shocking, the squalor, the poverty, the pain, and you bring it to life so vividly that it's really impressive. But I want to ask you what brought you to this, how you went into this journey, and how that topic was the road that you went down.
So about 21 years ago, my mother and some of her siblings were doing some family research and looking into, my granddad from Kinbarra had a bit of a mysterious past, we'd say, and they just wanted to find out more about his background.
Mm-hmm.
His birth cert showed that he'd been born in the workhouse. Nobody knew what that meant. It was, we were all intrigued by it. The word was kind of familiar, but there was no sense of, what it meant. Or I certainly didn't know it was anything to do with the famine. And, pardon me, I just set myself a little goal. I think we all did, to find out a bit more about what that meant. But within a few short months, I stumbled upon a book in Eason's in O'Connell Street. And it just jumped out at me, the workhouses of Ireland. I mean, I couldn't have, it just really, it was, you can call it coincidence or whatever. But I opened the first page of that on the bus on the way home from town that evening, and literally second or third paragraph down told the story of the Apopka family in just a few lines. And, it was the beginning of something, my introduction not only to that period of history, because I don't remember anything except it being mentioned in school, really. I didn't have any specific memories of what I learned about it. But this really did, it brought it to life for me. In a few lines, I was there. Mm-hmm. The man talked about, and it was a personal account by Padre O'Leary, who was a Gaelic language revival priest and writer in the early 1900s, but he was a neighbor of the Apopka family. And he talked about, so really I found out a little more when I went through the book. They were a very young family, 2 young children, and, basically when all of their options had been exhausted, they went to the poorhouse in Macroom, and within a week or two, a very short amount of time, the 2 children had died. They'd all been separated, and the wife then was gravely ill. There was some communication through Irish, and they got word to each other that the children had died, and they left the place, and she was gravely ill, as I said, and she couldn't get too far. He had to begin to carry her on his back, and there were obviously people who saw that. He carried her for some miles on his back to their little bohan up on a hill, and they were both found dead the next morning, and he was kneeling with his wife's feet held to his chest, is what the neighbour said, as if he'd been trying to warm them. I just thought it was the most profound image, and so powerful. It still rocks me every time. I find it very hard to say it even out loud. But I think, and I spent years trying to, because first of all, I wanted to know why we didn't know the story. Why didn't everybody know that story? And I thought, who could read that anywhere and not be moved by it? And as a young songwriter, the instinct to share it was instant as well, you know. So, and that led to a series of songs. But
and just before you continue with that journey carrying his wife on his back is what Declan just read to you there with the opening of the book. So that's Podrig carrying Caught back home to die, essentially. And I think it's no spoiler to tell you that a lot of people will die in this book. That's a spoiler alert. It was the famine.
not as many as you might think, actually, but
and then that led you into, so these people actually existed, and while the book is a novel, very many of the people in the book were real people, and it is historically very accurate, it's fair to say.
As much as I could make it be, I suppose,
So you actually, in sharing the story first, you had an album in 2017 called Chronicles of the Great Irish Famine. So this was where that led you to first before writing this story.
Yeah. I read a lot of books over the years. I mean, that very first introduction, I don't think I could have got a better one, because, you know, with the greatest of respect to so many of the writers of the books that I read later on it, you come across so much information that is kind of academic in nature, and it's information on legislation, and you get a lot of stuff recycled, and some of it sounds almost mythical, the accounts. I think I was very lucky to have hit that one first, because it did humanize it so much, and it set the bar for me then to find other accounts that were as clear as that. But I kind of was really, I suppose, kind of exhaustive, but over a long period of time, I just read lots and lots and lots of books about it. And it eventually, I was willing to take my time with it and write a collection of songs. Ultimately, that led to about an hour's worth of material. And after I finished, I thought that was it. I was happy to just say, that's that subject. But I played a concert in Skibbereen a few months after, and somebody came up to talk to me afterwards, and he said his father was from about a mile from where the Apopka family lived. And we got talking about the town land names and things like that. And one thing led to another, and a couple of days later I ended up being taken to see the remains of their cottage, which was, you know, fascinating to me. Well, for a start, I couldn't have imagined after all that time talking and singing about it and trying to find out. I'd written to libraries and archives and everything, trying to find out if there was anything. Just dead ends everywhere. And all of a sudden, you know, I had a direct link, and I was taken to, it was like ground zero, if you like, and to stand at the spot where this happened. And it was such a tiny, pathetic little footprint of a house up on this bleak hill, exposed to the elements for miles around, you know. And the man whose land it is now, his family have been there for generations. He said it had just recently been exposed by a gorse fire, and but he said I remember he said that if you stood up here in the wind, it would skin you alive, you know. And the amount of kind of information, tangible information or sensory information I even got in those moments standing up there just made me walk away saying, this story is not finished with me, even though I thought I was finished with it. And it set me on this journey, you know.
That's amazing that you by chance ran into that person, and it does seem like the story was chasing you. It was asking to be told. It
was, because around the same time I was approached by the Publishers Guild, who'd heard me talking about the record on the radio, and they said, do you think you'd like to expand it into book form? And you know, the timing of those things. And the third element was that I'd never been interested in writing prose. It had never been something that I aspired to before. People had suggested it to me along the way. A couple of people, Shay Healy, for example, said, you should be writing prose, you know. But the other element was that I woke up one morning to write a song about an old woman who lived across the street when we were kids, and we used to hide from her because she keeps sending you back to the shops. And we all had one of them, I think, you know.
Yeah.
But and I woke up thinking about her and saying, oh, what I wouldn't give to spend an hour in her company now. And I started trying to write a song for her. I had the whole day to myself, and it turned into a 20-page short story, which I'd never done before, and I really enjoyed that. So if that hadn't happened, I probably would have said, I don't think it's for me, you know. But I enjoyed it so much, I knew it was the sign or the door opening, you know.
Yeah, because I suppose the process is quite different from writing a song to writing, especially a book of this volume and magnitude. How did you find, when you got into it, did you ever hit that wall where you went, oh my God, what have I got myself into? Can I finish this?
No.
No?
I actually didn't want it to end.
Really?
Yeah, I was, yes, it is different to writing songs, but in so many ways it's similar. You know, I could joke and say it's like a very, very long song. I'm not known for my short little snappy poppy numbers anyway, but certain disciplines about writing, I think, were exactly the same, and I think I had developed maybe a confidence or a trust of your own instinct over years that I maybe even took for granted. But when it came to doing this, I knew from the start that the defining difference was that I knew I'd have to sit down and put myself in a place at a desk, and that you can't approach something of this magnitude with distractions and a little bit kind of paper mache, you know. It's got to be more focused and dedicated, you know. You can write songs anywhere on the go, you know, in your head, because they're quite short and you can remember it. But from the beginning, from the outset, I set a goal to lock myself in a room for a few hours every day, 6 days a week. And I thrived on that. I absolutely loved it. I had tried it with songwriting years ago, and it scared the living daylights out of me because it's quite different. Yeah. But I really loved it, and when lockdown kicked in, it was a real gift because I had no other distractions, and I upped the pace to 7 days a week at that point because I'd had trouble. The only frustration I'd ever had was actually getting the time and being able to find a routine with other work and with a young family. And
yeah.
So in lockdown, I went in. I didn't miss a single day in over 6 months, 7 days a week, which my wife was a little bit unhappy about. She started to call it the other woman.
I think now might be a good point to show the audience your T-shirt.
Oh, yeah.
The merchandise. So. I spent lockdown in 1846. So.
I just got one of those made for me and my editor, you know.
So the solitary...
It brings a whole new meaning to been there, wore the T-shirt, actually.
Yeah, it certainly does. But the solitary writing life, you enjoy that solitude and that focus.
I loved it. You know, when I was in the audience for the last talk with Robert and Catherine, and when Robert was saying that he loved when people weren't allowed to come out to the island, I could relate to that. Yeah. I love actually getting home and being home and closing the door and, you know, pottering around the garden or wherever. I'm kind of quite solitary in my thinking, I think, for somebody who's in what you might perceive as an extrovert profession.
Yeah, and I noticed, I've seen you on Instagram with your typewriter. Now, did any of that book get written on a typewriter, or was that just for show?
That was for show. My brother bought that as a present for me last Christmas, but I wrote it in pencil first.
Did you?
I wrote it in longhand, the first run of it. I did that because, again, from experience, I tried to write some music one time on a computer, you know, music notation, composing, And I found that writing it on the computer just brought me into the complete wrong part of my brain.
Yeah.
And it was a disaster. I hated it. And everything that came out was bad. And from then on, that was many years ago, I knew to never do that. And you write in your head first and then put it down. So I knew with a pencil or a pen sitting there, if you had to make a decision first, for at least for my method, I'm sure it's different for everybody, I knew it would be more successful for me, and it was, and it was a romance to it, that too. Maybe you wouldn't do it with every book, I don't know, but I really enjoyed doing it that way.
Yeah. Speaking of romance, I suppose another character in the book is the narrator. I suppose you'd call him the narrator, Cornelius Creed, who was the pawnbroker of the title. And when I started reading the book, I almost wasn't sure what I was supposed to think about Cornelius, because as a pawnbroker, I'm like,
Good.
Is he the evil guy? Am I supposed to hate him? And then it's like, he seems nice. Is this a trick? But I think he seems like a good guy, and you really kind of humanize him, I suppose. He almost seems like, this bit you wanted to read, I think, really shows Cornelius and his wife and their relationship, and the personal side of it. There's so much in this book that is, I suppose, the historical side of it, and there's a lot of the meetings of the poor law guardians of the town, and all of the very factual historical things that add all that historical meat to it. But then the sort of more fictional elements, I suppose, that you've had to imagine and really bring the emotional side of these characters to life, I think is such a beautiful contrast to that you go from one side to the other very neatly to break up the historical fact with the human side of it. And I think this is a lovely conversation between Cornelius and his wife, if you would like to.
Thank you. Yeah, just a little background on Creed himself, because when I began, of course, my goal, I suppose, was to find out about the Apopka family, Padraig and Koch, and how they survived as long as they did, and in trying to find all of this information and reading the newspapers of the time and going into archives and that, I began to find other people in the area. I mean, they lived about 6 miles outside of town, on the outskirts of Macroom. In the centre of town was Cornelius Creed. He was one of the characters who at first started to just appear every once in a while, but he became more and more frequent, and as I discovered more of his writings, because he was corresponding to the newspapers. And
those correspondences that are reprinted in the book were as they would have appeared, is that right, in the Irish Examiner of the day?
Some of them, his pieces, yeah. And he was a beautiful writer. He was really intelligent, intellectual kind of person. I actually think he was probably a little bit on the spectrum, even though I'm sure they didn't have that term. But he was very high functioning, I think, and super into detail. But anyway, he began as a source of information for me, but slowly began to win me over as somebody who I couldn't leave out. He's not the narrator per se, because I don't think, it's quite interesting. My editor and I had lots of talks about things like that, who was talking, but really, when it's like a two-sided story. I think they begin from the same root. But anyway, sorry, I'm.
But this is him and his wife, Cornelius and his wife, are coming home from a birthday party, and this is their chat on the way.
Thank you. They hadn't far to wander through the streets of Macroom. The O'Riordan's house was down the east end of Castle Street, and it was a straight path west from there to the square for Creed and Pallellen. But Creed was in no hurry to end the pleasant feelings of the evening, and the air being so nice to take, they stepped slowly as they went. Gripping his arm as they walked, Llewellyn began a tentative conversation that caught Creed by surprise. Do you ever wonder, Con? Wonder what, dear? What it would have been like if we'd had a family of our own? Pulled out of the hypnosis he'd been enjoying, focusing on the rhythm of their feet tramping the cobbles, Creed took a long breath and deliberated on how best to answer. A horse could be heard neighing within the car house adjoining one of the shops further up the opposite side of the street. But in the absence of an answer, perhaps afraid of the silence, Llewellyn sought to clarify and elaborate. I know it's beyond our understanding, and I don't regret anything. I know we have a comfortable life. Hearing Pat saying those lovely things to the children, like you have to be up for Mass in the morning, or seeing the joy on Mary's face when the girls carried in the trays, you know. Sometimes I just wish we could have had some of that. Creed listened calmly, still open to an answer that might come to him, but in just as little of a hurry to force such an answer as their feet, ambling over the darkened stones, were to reach home. Surely she knew how he felt. She could not have forgotten. They had talked about this years before. It wasn't that he did not want children, and although he didn't long for them like she did, it wasn't something they had any control over. Had she seen the longing in his face as he watched the O'Riordans, coveting their closeness and affections, how he'd looked at Mary when he talked to her, the faint residual feelings of the boy within him, remnants of the still raw but innocent history that he and Mary quietly shared since childhood days. He in love with his school friend's sister. Mary likely did not even remember. But it wasn't anything Pal needed to concern herself about. It was just a layer of paint, buried under the many layers of paint that covered the walls of his memory, like the sign above his shop that, through its own lifetime, had been painted over and painted over with names, titles, fresh colours and new lettering, the old never to be seen again, but each still supporting the layer above them all the way to its present incarnation. Powell did not need to know about that. He couldn't remember if he'd ever told her about his former feelings, but perhaps she sensed it, or something like it. Either way, he was confused. Logic told him there was no enduring problem in his and Llewellyn's relations. Heart had no bearing on the reality. It was neither feelings nor wishes that governed the fact of their being a childless family. But Creed, as her husband, instinctively knew he must strive to understand regardless. It was the least he could do. He felt for his wife that she was still suffering in this way. It was clear now that she must have been carrying these thoughts all along. Of course, dear, I wonder too. Perhaps not as often. It might be different for a woman who would long to be a mother. The instinct to nurture is... But he had no idea. He heard himself attempt an offering, but he could never know the lingering lack of fulfillment, the feeling of something missing that a woman has who so desperately wants to have a family, but who for some reason known only to her maker is not given to be a mother, despite her ever kind and nurturing nature, her endless supply of love to give to a child, the will and prayers of a saint for God to answer, until one day she knows it will never happen. He did know that for those reasons, Llewellyn was always the subject of a quiet pity among her female friends and her sister. But perhaps saddest of all, she pitied herself. She soldiered on because she had no choice but to. But life had put a stone in her shoe that gave her a limp. Creed was not always on the list of those who pitied her, only at times like this when she spilled over and it became obvious. Perhaps he was too busy with his business, his writing, and the meetings to appreciate the depth of her sadness. On the other hand, a sustained sense of pity was not conducive to a marriage of equals. Creed did like children, quite a bit even. He was often surprised at how well he could relate to them, especially bright children. He had been genuine and sincere in his praise of Kate that evening, of all the O'Riordan children, and of Charlotte. And he was as genuine and true to his feelings when, nearing home that night, he told Pal Ellen, "I would like to have had children, Pal, and especially because I know how much you would have loved them. A child's light is the light of the world, to be held up high for all the world to see by it. But it wasn't fated for us to have a family of our own." "I know," she answered softly. Somehow it shortened the distance between them.
Thank you for that. It's one last question. I mean, I'm conscious of the time, and I do want to leave some time for the audience. So think of your questions now, and I'll come to you in a second. But I suppose an interesting thing in this book is there are different classes of people in it. So you've had to deal with a lot of different voices. The poor who probably would have been speaking Irish mostly, but you're writing them through English. Then you have the sort of middle class, and then upper classes again, who mostly come into it in the public meetings that are going on. How did you find writing all those different voices and going from one level to the next? And did they stay in your head for a long time afterwards?
It was very exciting as, you know, a writer, I suppose, trying to give them their voice and to follow their voice, and to watch them develop. Some of them you hear more clearly than others, and some of them reveal themselves to you slowly. So it was, I felt honored in many ways to be telling this story. I felt a great responsibility to do it well. And by the end of it, you know, you care for the people so much. It was, you know, it's very hard to describe how much I feel for them now, because they are people that you really feel like you know, and they were real. And you know, it's interesting because I feel like they are alive again in a way. You know, they're people who have come out of, for me alone even, come out of nothing, and you're all of a sudden aware of their existence and the tiniest details of their lives, and it's both exciting and moving, and really, really enjoyable to work with. It gave me great motivation to go into the room every day. I loved it, and there was never a single moment that I felt it was difficult. I really enjoyed it. I didn't want it to end, really. And going back to your...
It ends in 1846. Is there room for a sequel in 1847, maybe?
Well, yeah, you know, that goes right back to your first comment about it being big, and some people have said that. You know, it was very difficult to keep the lid on, because it is such a vast subject, I think, you know, and as somebody who's read so much about it, I think this period of our history has been begging for a long time. At once, it deserves a War and Peace. It deserves a Schindler's List or a Schindler's Ark. It deserves to be a much bigger book, even. You know, it was very hard to. My goalposts after circling the pocket, if you like, for a while, ended up being the second half of 1846 alone in there. You know, we know the famine lasted years, so
this is the tip of the iceberg.
It is the tip of the iceberg, and I'm quite proud that it's big, because it deserves to be. And I think I will be going back in. I think
you've definitely caught the writing bug. And do you think you'll go back into the famine or somewhere else? Have you started something?
I haven't started another one yet, but I know where I'm going.
You know where you're going. Thank you so much. I think it's so important, as you said, that especially when these are real people, that you've given them a voice again. And it's a bit of history that we have and are moving away from very far and very fast. And it's good to be reminded of it, I think, and be rooted in it. So thank you. I'd love to
Thank
give
you,
everyone
Diana.
here a chance. I know people are probably dying to ask you some questions, so
Please
someone
do.
be brave and be the first one.
Hi, I've got 4 or 5 questions for you, but I'll stick with one. It won't take too long. When you say you wrote with pencil, what did that look like? Are you talking about writing on sheets of paper? Are you talking about writing in a notebook? How many notebooks did you end up with? What does that look like when you're sitting in a room with pencil? What are you writing on?
So I used those, probably a little bigger than that. You know, it's not an A4 journal, but like a diary-sized thing. I filled about 5 of those.
And did you write from start to finish?
Not in linear fashion, if that
Okay.
makes sense, but I jumped around a lot as I was writing, which the research I think makes you do, you know.
So, can I just, to understand what you're saying there, if you're not writing in a linear fashion, but when you're writing in your notebook then, are you writing, so if your research is based on one element, but that element may appear in sections throughout the book, it may or may not, but that is my question, are you writing then those pieces as one piece as you're on a particular week or a particular series of weeks?
It's a difficult question to answer, but I think the simplest way of answering is that I focused on chapters, because every chapter in the book is based around an event that actually happened. And it began then to, it didn't take me long to figure out that it would be chronological when it landed, but because each chapter was based around an event, I didn't need to write them in a chronological fashion, if that makes sense. And in a way that was fun to do, because I didn't feel like it was, you know, I had to stick to a map in a way. But also, inevitably, as you try to find out about certain things, or you could be researching one thing and find something else, and it would drag you there. And because it was exciting, and you know, one of the rules I know is, not a rule, but one of my own rules I know from writing for years with songs, is that when something strikes you and you feel it in that moment, the emotion of it or the power of it, if you don't go with that right then, it will dissipate. And even when you go back to it a half an hour or 5 minutes later, it can be hard to remember exactly the words that came to your mind when you thought that. So when something comes to you fresh like that, it's best to drop whatever you're doing and work on that, and then you can go back to whatever it was you were chasing. So that pulled me all around the world, if you like, and eventually I had to begin to shape it all and make the jigsaw fit.
To do that in a notebook then on a computer, you could imagine doing it on a computer that you can.
Yeah,
Notebook
I
and then
guess.
also-
But I think on a computer you have, again, I can only speak for my own method and my own feelings on it, but I think you have too many options and you have too much opportunity to move it around. I knew that if I had to make decisions now, what it looked like was a mess, you know, because what you'd end up is I would make a decision and then I'd move down and then I'd say, well, no, really, that sentence should be down here, or that one should be up there. So I would draw little lines, and you know, and then I had to piece it together. And sometimes you'd go back and you'd be doing this and say, you know.
And I can imagine even with a pencil, I mean, if I was to write with pencil or to write, I'd have to think about what I was typing, where my fingers were. Whereas I would imagine the flow is much simpler through a pen or a pencil.
It's nicer. Again, for me it was. And maybe as well because I was writing something that felt like it was from a different period of time and a different era. The computer might have felt a little too foreign for that, you know. Pencil made it feel more like I was there, maybe, you know. So.
Very good. You have any other questions?
Lovely question, thank you.
You can tell Siobhan's an editor.
Aha.
Can I just say, I love that expression, like put a stone in her shoe.
Oh.
I haven't heard that before. Is that an expression, or is it something that you?
I don't think so. I don't think I've heard it before.
That's fabulous. I just love that. Like put a stone in her shoe and caused her a limb. Yeah, that's just beautiful. That's one of those lines that you just kind of get to.
Yeah.
That's going to circle around my head for a long time, and sure I'll reuse it.
Thank you. I hope you don't get one in yours.
I'm sure we all get them all.
You do.
It depends how big or small they are, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Anybody else? Oh, yeah, Frank.
Yeah. Hi there.
Hello.
I have a question. It's basically about the famine in general, because you said that when you began exploring the subject, you came to it with very little recollection of what you learnt in school. And you clearly put an enormous amount of research, reading, and time and effort into it. And I'm just interested to see, where has that, on that journey, where has that brought you to today? What's your view on the famine and how it fits in with, the history of Ireland and the Irish psyche? I'm just interested to see how that's evolved over the time you've been doing the research and the writing. Because the other thing that struck me from when you were talking was that, 175 years later, or whatever, you almost feel like the real story of the famine has never been recorded. And to see how you view it now.
It's a great question, and we could talk about this all night. There are many different aspects to your question alone. I think you're right. I think it has been vastly underexposed, probably for very real reasons that, and I think for me, and as somebody of this generation, say, and born as recently as I have been, I don't understand those reasons. The reasons why it was kept quiet for so long. And Dr. Christine Kennelly, who is one of the leading scholars and academics on the subject, she made a brilliant point in a book that I thought was a real, was a bit of an epiphany for me to discover it. She said that in 1994, there was a turning point. And I think there were probably two reasons. One, the main one she gave was that it coincided with the peace process, I think, which is very, very interesting, because we moved at that point in the same way that we did with 2016 and being able to celebrate the centenary of 1916. I think we moved to a point where it was safer to explore our history and to not feel that you were doing something dangerous or incendiary or contributing to something incendiary, and all the tension that went with the Troubles. The other reason, and the reason I speak about my own generation and people of our generation, is that it has been pointed out by numerous people and written about that people are ashamed of their own poverty and embarrassed by poverty, their own poverty, and they tend to push it away. And of course, in the 90s, we had the Celtic Tiger and all of that. Up until that point, I think we'd always classed ourselves as a third world country, and we had the recession in the 80s even, right before it. I think after that point, people who are growing up in Ireland don't necessarily feel as connected to the history in such a way. It's far enough back that we, whatever this thing that people call the shame, and my only understanding of that word from my own perspective was when somebody, before the book came along, but after I'd written songs on the subject, somebody invited me to go and maybe talk in a primary school and sing the songs to some of the kids there. And I was like, what? How could you do that, you know? How could you talk about such a grim subject or such a scary subject? And in that realization, I thought about if you were an elder or an adult or a parent in the wake of these events, how could you tell it to your children? Nobody would have dared speak about it to their children because it would have been so horrific and scary, and they probably couldn't bring themselves to even think about it. It was like, because they lived in a time when it was, you know, they were that a breath away from it all the time, maybe happening again. It had happened over and over and over. So it took probably a very long time before. Anyway, as I said, I could go on and on and on. I don't know if that answers your question well. Thank you.
I'll give you an easy question. So the opening of the book there is I hope fairly clearly that same story, let's say in your song, Poor Boy's Shoes, I would guess. And you know, would the book have a lot of other crossover characters from that you maybe touched upon in your album, Chronicles of the Irish Famine? Do others show up? I won't call them characters because I suppose they're kind of real. But, you know, do you touch on other people that maybe you touched on artistically before?
Thank you. Good question. And no is the answer. When I had the initial discussions with Nikki Howard at Gill Publishers, who invited me to do it, they were very kind and gave me a kind of a blank canvas, and they said, you can do whatever you want. You could do, it could be a children's book again, that I thought that I didn't know how I would do that, but a children's book, or it could be short stories based around the songs, it could be a novel, it could be, and initially I did begin with short stories based near the songs, but not on them. You know, I was very adamant that I wasn't going to repeat what happened in the songs, because I thought, what's the point in doing that? Just trying to reinvent the same thing in a different medium. You know, it had to be maybe from a more interesting perspective, or tangential. It might be something that happened before what happened in one of the songs, or in each case, you know. And I wrote maybe 3 or 4 chapters, and it was kind of a nebulous exploration at that point. I thought they would end up in the book. None of them did. But when I went back to, when I began one on the Apopka family, I got kind of sucked down the rabbit hole, if you like. It was, and that had drawn me right back to the very first inspiration I'd had to write on the subject, and it was the fact that this was a human story. I still feel in a way that for your mind and your heart, it's a bigger thing than the famine itself. You know, we can't process something that big, but the experience of one family we can all relate to, because we all have loved ones and we know how we feel about them. And I think, you know, when I kind of got pulled into that, I knew that was it, and it was just went at it then. I kind of had the bit in my mouth. I didn't look back at any of the other stories, you know. Well, thank you.
Sorry, just picking up on that, Declan, Terry Pratchett said, you know, man is not dead while his name is still spoken. And the responsibility of writing about real characters, you know, these were a real family, and you can hear it, you know, when you speak about them, you speak quite passionately. But was there lots of responsibility, you know, a fictional character the world is, you know, your oyster, you can write whatever you want. But the responsibility of writing about a real family who, you know, perhaps have descendants that are
Yeah, absolutely. Not in the sense that it scared me, or that I was afraid of somebody reproaching me about it, or you know, more just out of care and wanting to get it right, and out of a kind of a respect, you know. But you know, inevitably you have to fill in the blanks, and anybody can only paint a picture through the lens of their own experience and their own feelings and what you imagine might have happened. That's all based on the things that you've learned, and you know, you've learned about, in this case, family and feelings for your family, and you know, so it was very much fueled by that, and in a way that you're not aware of when you're writing, you're becoming part of it in that way, or it's so. But really, it was just a responsibility to do it well, and to try and share the story, because I think it's such an important story. I think it's not just for Irish people, I think for people anywhere. It teaches us empathy. These stories teach us empathy, and they're very important to keep alive and share.
Great, thank you so much, Declan. And thank you all for your questions and for supporting the festival as well. Let's give Declan one more round of applause.
Thank you, Brianna. Thank you so much.
Just another bit of housekeeping before we finish up. Just to say that Declan is going to leave the stage and go into the room directly to the left there, where he'll be signing copies of his book. Dingle Bookshop are set up in there if anybody wants a copy. And I'd just finally like to thank you all so much for supporting the festival. It really means a lot to us to see you here tonight. It's been a fantastic weekend, and it's gone by all too quickly. But if anybody wants to watch back, any of the things are all up online on our YouTube channel, or you can go through the dinglelit.ie website as well if you want to watch back anything you missed. And once again, thank you so much for choosing Dingle Lit for your first literary festival, Declan. I'm sure there'll be many more, and we'd be delighted to have you back again when the next book comes out as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.